afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming along to this session today. As Tom's just said, I think there's been an awful lot of focus recently on carbon footprinting, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sort of climate change in general. And today, really, this session is looking at perhaps the wider area of environmental footprinting. How can an organisation look at their entire impact on the environment? I think it's really important that organisations don't focus on just their carbon footprint and therefore, lose that focus on perhaps the other impacts that they're having. I think, as any business knows, legislation on the environment is becoming more and more prevalent. The Environmental Liability Directive that's soon to hit us is putting even more pressure on organisations to manage their environmental impacts. And I know when I started off in the environmental arena some 18 or so years ago, it was a fairly low-level topic. My background was from the regulatory side of things, working for the Environment Agency, and we were always calling for tougher fines for environmental offences. Recently, looking at the Guardian website, I spotted a wines company over in Telford that had just been fined £225,000 for flouting the packaging laws. That type of fine is becoming less uncommon. The penalties are getting tougher on organisations out there that aren't managing their environmental impacts in an appropriate manner. So, at the heart of environmental pollution control, carbon footprinting, energy efficiency, and indeed any matter that refers to environmental action, I believe that there's a critical concept, particularly if we want to compare one organisation to another, or we want to look at our competitors and see what they're doing. And that critical concept is consistency, some way of benchmarking ourselves against others. How do we calculate a carbon footprint? What is the best way to manage our environmental impacts? And indeed, is one way better than another? Unsurprisingly, coming from a UCAS accredited certification body, I believe that standards such as ISO 14001, the Environmental Management System Standard, is a way that organisations can manage their environmental impacts in a systematic and consistent way. Without standards, perhaps we're all using a compass that isn't calibrated. There is no agreed benchmark around which we work. Historically, international standards such as 14001 haven't actually set targets for companies. It's up to the companies themselves, the organisations themselves, to set their own objectives and to set their own targets. And I believe that this actually makes standards all-inclusive. It means that they can apply to any organisation, irrespective of the size of that organisation, and indeed irrespective of what they do as an organisation. So whether I'm a one-man individual architect organisation or of a very large food manufacturing organisation, that standard can still be used by me as an organisation. The time of 14001 first being released in 1996, environmental awareness was perhaps relatively low amongst organisations, particularly perhaps in the SME sector. I think the very nature of 14001, and I think it's testament to that standard, that thousands of organisations, tens of thousands of organisations worldwide have used this standard to help them navigate through the minefield that is managing their environmental impacts. 14001's received some bad press over the years, people saying that it's toothless, people saying it doesn't specify the targets that an organisation has to reach. But I would argue perhaps that view's a little bit short-sighted. Let's bear in mind the number of organisations that have decided to use it as a vehicle. and that it's mobilised those businesses and those organisations to become environmentally aware, and thus generally increasing environmental awareness and the impact on the environment worldwide. So I reflect on 14001 as a pioneering standard that's been developed with this spirit of continual improvement at its very heart. And I think new standards that are being developed in this arena, such as BS 16001, have continued in that vein and that spirit of continual improvement being at its heart. So these standards are there to consider and to ask organisations to use best practice, to use them as a tool or a vehicle to help them manage their environmental impact in a systematic and consistent way. And because they're used nationally and indeed in the international arena, it means that they can provide this benchmarking, this comparison between competitors. Also, they take into account, by allowing organisations to set their own targets, where that organisation is at the moment and indeed where they want to be, and also how long it's going to take them to get there. And I think most critically, particularly at the present time, allows them to consider the economic constraints under which they'll be operating. So how can the implementation of an environmental management system such as 14001 actually help an organisation to deal with their environmental footprint? Perhaps the best way to answer this is to ask questions. Who in your company is responsible for controlling your environmental impact? If something goes wrong or an environmental incident occurs, what's the procedure? Who does what? Who do we call? Perhaps there was a rough plan, but maybe something's changed since then. I remember going into an organisation that had a really, really good system in place for dealing with their environmental incidents, but someone had changed something. They'd locked all their spill kit away in a cupboard. Nobody knew where the key was. The incident occurred. How do we get to the spill kit? We can't. So what's changed? What's somebody else in the organisation done? Who's leading this? Who's updating it? Who's checking that this plan is still right for us? These are just a few questions that we could ask ourselves. Sometimes those questions may lead us scratching our heads. Of course, it is possible that a company who isn't using a structured management system like 14001 could address all of these examples. I don't believe that 14001 is required to address these things. However, I do believe that through the implementation of 14001, the chances of an organisation missing something is reduced. I think of environmental impacts, managing those environmental impacts, a little bit like a maze. Each maze is very different ways to work your way through it, and 14001 acts as a vehicle or a formula to help you navigate your way through that maze. Without it, you could still do it, but it might take you longer, you might take some wrong turns along the way, and it's probably going to be an awful lot harder. Anyone that knows 14001 will know that it's broken down into a series of sections to help you try and systematically manage your environmental impact. Areas like environmental policy, setting objectives and targets, having plans and programs and procedures in place, and auditing those, and then reviewing your action to help generate this spirit of continual environmental improvement. Each of these sections is further broken down into a number of sub-clauses, And those really look at the requirements, the things that you need to have in place as an organisation to help you manage your environmental footprint. So enough about the theory and looking at an example of how this has really helped an organisation. I'll move on to a 50-year-old organisation with 9,000 staff based at around 70 locations up and down the UK. The Brakes Group is one of the largest operators in the food service industry, with an annual turnover of approximately £2 billion. They've used ISO 14001 as a vehicle to help them manage their environmental footprint and to help them look at how they impact on the environment. They've developed an environmental policy outlining what their intentions are. They've set themselves objectives and targets on when and how they're going to meet those objectives. Both of these as core elements of 14001. I think critically and very importantly, they've defined the responsibilities throughout that organisation. Logistically, with that many staff and that many sites, communication is absolutely key. And they've chosen to actually put in place environmental management champions to help communicate across everybody within the organisation the importance that they feel this has. They started with very simple steps, awareness campaigns, and asking employees to think green. And they use their environmental management system to help identify their key impacts on the environment. Waste is a big issue for them. Energy consumption, what they call food miles, so the logistics of moving their products around the country. They've defined what these key impacts are, and they've started to look at each one of those and set targets for improvement. A large amount of their business depends on maintaining both chilled and frozen goods in temperature-controlled environments. Obviously, those temperature-controlled environments are using energy. So this is one of their key aspects that they've homed in on. They've started to use automatically controlled fridge and freezer doors with alarms on them. So energy is both conserved and indeed temperatures maintained, but likewise, if a door's left open, an alarm sounds, someone closes that door, it reduces energy consumption. Through communicating their plans using procedures that they developed in their environmental management system, they've increased their recycling activity. They've reduced their packaging by up to 20% on many of their own brands. That not only helps them, but also their customers too. They're also making sure that their vehicles are full to capacity, so reducing their food miles. Fundamentally, this environmental management system is not specific instructions in the standard as to how about doing things, but it's about guiding you. It's about telling you how to manage your environmental footprint. Unfortunately, time's running short now, and really 15 minutes isn't long enough to tell you all about 14001 and its benefits. But hopefully this has provided you with an overview. One of the things that I'd like you to go away from today and think about and reflect upon is what good are our actions, indeed any of our actions, unless we're managing them in a consistent and systematic way. Thank you very much.